My end value for the dollar is zero.
Yeah.
Zero.
When is that going to happen? I mean, let me
not
ask
tomorrow,
you.
but obviously not
15 years,
tomorrow.
30 years, what
well,
are we talking about?
I think in like 10 years, 12 years time, the US dollar will be like wallpaper.
Yeah.
The dollar is in danger, great danger, and we're in worse shape than we were in the 70s, and it was rather chaotic then. So we're moving into a very, very dangerous era, according to what the gold price is telling us.
Make no mistake, the path that we're on right now is not sustainable. This is not the type of growth dynamic that the United States needs to stay on indefinitely. It cannot do that. So far, the house price appreciation has stayed excessive. So far, real interest rates have stayed low. So far, America's foreign creditors have kept funding our external deficits. So far, the crisis that could emerge from this combination has yet to occur. And the longer these problems do not surface, the deeper the complacency becomes that maybe we can get away with this indefinitely. It's human nature.
But even at a high political level, you think they're that naive? I mean, they should see the risks as well.
You're making presumptions about the wisdom of our political leaders that I think are a stretch.
But I don't see any actions in Washington where people are seriously saying we've got to do something about this. Quite the opposite. They're doing the opposite. They're trying to debase the dollar even further. Despite all this talk about a strong dollar, their actions speak louder than words.
Unfortunately, we buried capitalism years ago, and we've been talking about this. Nothing the government is doing is legal. They're violating the Constitution with everything that they do. But, Paulson said today about this plan, he said it was necessary and unprecedented. And he's wrong on both counts. It's completely unnecessary. And unfortunately, there is precedent for this type of monetary policy. They tried it in Argentina. They tried it in Weimar Republic, Germany. They're trying it right now in Zimbabwe. I got right here in my hand 100 billion Zimbabwe dollars. And if I spend it quickly enough, I can buy a pack of chewing gum. This is the road they're taking us down. We don't need liquidity in this country. We need savings. And the government is trying to inject the banks with all this liquidity so they can loan it out. But you can't do that. We need legitimate underconsumption to have real savings. All the government is providing us with is inflation, and we're going to get more and more of it. So,
in 2005, a Dutch documentary was released posing a scenario in which the dollar collapses 25% against the euro in one day. Since the making of that documentary, the dollar has lost 17% of its value against the euro, and even more against other currencies and commodities. At the time of the documentary, the US government was borrowing $3 billion per day to finance its spending. Today, the government is borrowing and printing close to $5 billion per day. The US national debt is now over $12 trillion, and US unfunded liabilities now add up to $106 trillion. To put this in perspective, the US collects about $2 trillion in tax revenue. This would make the national debt 6 times larger than what the government collects in taxes, and it would make the unfunded liabilities more than 50 times larger than the US federal tax revenue. In all past cases of high inflation or hyperinflation, the main cause was too much government and national debt, which causes governments to print money in order to service the debts. Over the past 30 years, many governments have irresponsibly wiped out their nation's currencies and the wealth of their citizens. Some of the most recent cases of hyperinflation over the past 3 decades include countries like Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Poland, Ukraine, and most recently, Zimbabwe. The script of an inflationary movie is always the same. Irresponsible or corrupt politicians take on huge debts in the name of the nation's citizens. They spend the money on themselves and on friends in big business, and they leave the citizens to pay back the debts, and ultimately, they leave the citizens at the fate of inflation. Usually, the corrupt politicians and insiders stash their own money, investments, and savings outside of their own collapsing economy and currency. All the while, they tell the people of the nation that everything will be fine. Meanwhile, average citizens lose their savings, pensions become worthless, and middle-class citizens are thrown into poverty. Recent history offers many cautionary tales of inflationary economic policies. These policies have brought economic destruction to many nations and impoverished entire middle classes. If Americans choose to continue down this inflationary path, the United States could become the next cautionary tale.
Bolivia. What's the inflation rate in Bolivia this week? Because we had galloping hyperinflation that destroyed our economic base.
We found that Bolivia was the 7th highest inflation in the history of man.
23,500%. Prices increased by the hour.
The root of the problem was government finances. The government was spending 30 times more than it received in taxes.
For decades, they just printed money. They collected no taxes. If you can't collect taxes, you have to make money up somehow, and so you just printed it.
Bolivia was a basket case. We were considered hopeless. We had help from nobody. We were totally alone. The World Bank had closed its office. The IMF had pulled out its representative. And the American government and other friendly nations wouldn't answer the telephones.
When I got to La Paz in July 1985, the inflation rate was about 60,000%. It was an extraordinary and terrifying thing to see, actually. It was a society at the edge of the precipice.
We told him, you have 90 days before Bolivia's hyperinflation becomes the highest inflation in world history. So he told us, okay, you have 20 days, you have to start working now.
There was a big discussion whether you could stop a hyperinflation or inflation period by taking gradual steps. In this, Jeff Sachs was influential. He's had all this gradual stuff that just doesn't work. When it really gets out of control, you got to stop it. Like in medicine, you got to take some radical steps, otherwise your patient is going to die.
In August 1985, Goni went public with a program called shock therapy.
It caught everybody by surprise. It had great credibility. It was a shock.
Shock therapy spelled the death of dependency theory. Government spending was slashed. Price controls were scrapped. Import tariffs were cut. Government budgets were balanced.
We didn't use highly sophisticated economic theory to deal with hyperinflation. We just used very simple things, such as from now on the government will only spend what it gets. You get 1 peso, spend 1 peso. You get 2 pesos, spend 2 pesos. If we don't have it, we don't spend it. No borrowing from the central bank, and therefore the central bank did not have to print money.
Shock therapy meant that the price of essentials, transport, food, fuel, all shot up. Until then, people had thought that only a military dictatorship like Chile's could impose such tough measures without tearing society apart.